Now on Daf Ayin Daled Amud Beis, and we're studying the statement of Rav Yehuda, meaning the Amora, Hachi Kama. This is what the Tanakama means. Kol Asurim Lovo Bakal Kahuna. Mainiu. So again, see that Rav Yehuda, the Amora, is introducing a new element in the equation, interpreting the Mishnah of the Tanakama, that is Psul Kahuna. We've been understanding the Chachamim in our Mishnah is referring to Psulei Kol. Now we're shifting to Psulei Kahuna. Now, who are the Psulei Kahuna who are not included in Psulei Kol, obviously, is Giores Chusa Mibash Sholosh Shonim Yom Echad. Now, this is a sugya we didn't get to on Daf Ayin Ches. So that's really futuristic. I think that'll be in November. Ayin Ches will be in November, after we change the clock. And we're talking about a Gioris who's less than 3 years old. So even though she was a Goyata at one point, and we assume that a Goyata had Be'ila to an Akum, and if she be Psul Lakuna, but she was less than 3. She was less than 3 that she's not Ru'il Abiyah. So when the Chacham says Asura L'Kayin, we have to understand why, but that's going to be a sugya on Daf Ayin Ches. We haven't gotten to it. And in the footnote here, again, I guess we'll get to this later on Daf Ayin Ches, the Shita of the Chachamim is derived from a pasuk in Yechezkel. And this has to do with what's called a Chal Shem Zona. That a Giores has a Chal Shem Zona L'Kahuna, which is a very strange kind of halacha because there was no Be'ila. I mean, even if there was a Be'ila, that's not called Be'ila. So that we'll have to wait and see how we derive that from Yechezkel. Udelo Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. So if Shimon Bar Yochai goes with our compelling logic that if she's less than 3 years old, she's allowed to marry a Kohen. Because the Be'ila with a less than a 3-year-old girl is not a Be'ila, so she never had a Be'ila Posela, she's not a Zona, she's Muteros L'Kuhun. And the Tanakama now adds something to the previous Mishnah, and that is that Psulei Kahuna, which includes, according to Tanakama's unique Shita, a Gioris Pchusa Vivash Shanim, is Mutarim Lovo Zebeze. She's allowed to marry Psulei Kol, like Mamzerim, like Nesinim. And why? Because she's Psul Kahuna. So we have here what I call an inverse relationship. If you're Pasul Kahuna, then you're mutter to Psulei Kol. Just the opposite. Again, I don't say it's a Siba, but it's a Siman L'Davar. What do I mean? The very fact that it's Psulei Kahuna, that already brings you out of the Kol. You're not included in Mamzelo Yov Kal Shem. I mean, this was the Josh of Rava, you remember, but he gave it the wrong place in Machos. I mean, Rava got away with it. Rav Ada got in trouble, if you remember. So Mutarim, Lavo, Zebazet. So you have this case of a Gioris Pchusa Migash Shalosh, which, and according to Rabbanan, she's Psula L'Kuhuna. And therefore, it's unbelievable. She's allowed to marry a mamzer. And that's called Mutarim Zebazeh. So this is what I might call Roman numeral number 1 in the sugya. And that's the interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to spend a long time slugging up this pshat in the Mishnah. And then we're going to get to Roman numeral number 2, which is going to be Rabbi Nosson. So what objection does the Gemara raise against the interpretation of Yehuda? Correcting Gemara, v'nukma b'basholosh shana v'yom echad v'afilu Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Why do you assume that the Tanakama has in mind a Gioris Pchusa Mibasholosh? Maybe she's a Gioris who's already Shalosh Shana V'Yom Echad. So the Gioris took place after her third birthday, 3 years and 1 day. And therefore we could square even with Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Because Reb Shimon Bar Yochai requires, in order to set up this psul, a giorish and his gaira li'achar she'igia legimel shana v'yom echad. So let's say the bas shalosh shana v'yom echad she is gaira, and she's muteres l'kol because she's excluded from kahuna and she's not called kol. So Gemara answers him, Cain, if we're going to interpret Tanakama that only a giores who was this gaira li'achar shalosh shana, like Reb Shimon Bar Yochai said, and therefore she's ksheira l'kuhuna, she's psula kuhuna because the gerus took place after she was royal abil. So Gemara says, if that be the case, then mitzida tavra. I mean, if you switch it around the other way, it's a little easier to understand. Tavra mitzida, which means that there's already like a broken something over here, right here on the side. Meaning, from this diuk that comes out that we're talking about a Giores Chusami Bashol Shalom, who's Asur Lamamzer, then we're going to ask the following question: only because the Geras took place after she reached her third birthday, then she's considered psulei kol. We can be medayik that pchusa b'shalosh shanim yom echad. If she had the Geras before she reached her third birthday, is to muteres love of a kol kahuna. According to Reb Shimon, she's allowed to marry a Kohen. Is then asura lovo zebazeh? If the Geras, now I read it with a question mark. I should read it with an exclamation mark. If we're talking about a chusa mibash sholoshan v'yom echchin is gaira, and she's muteres l'kal kahuna, then she should be asura lovo zebazeh. Can it be? What logic is that? That she can't marry psulim? I mean, you're telling me she's muteres l'kal kuhuna because the Geras took place before she was royal Leviah. So now the conclusion has to be that she's Bechlal Kahal. And if she's Bechlal Kahal, then she's included in the Isur Mamza Liyov B'Kal Hashem. Is therefore it should be Asura Lovu Zebazeh. She can't marry Psula. Frekti Gemara. Hooray. Chusa vibash shol shol Rabbi Shimon muteres love b'kol kuna umuteres love zebazeh. Could it possibly be, based on Rashbi, that if the Geras took place before she was 3, she's muteres l'kuhuna, and she has no psul kuhuna, Now you're going to tell me mutaros lovos zebazet. Again, the reason why in a case of Pchusa Mibashal Shonim, Rav Shimon Bar Yochai was matir is because she's still in Kal Hashem. But if, on the other hand, if she was what? A Bashal Shonim v'Echad, Yom Echad, so why is she allowed to marry a apostle? It can only be if you hold Kahal Gerim Eino Kol. So if you're going to hold Kal Gerim Eino Kol, then by the same token of that logic, you should be Mater Giorish and his Garab Yosef Pchusa Mibashal Shonim. Why is that? So let me just read to you the Masechet. He explains it. He says, Hare Eina Bichlal Kol. Right? If she was this Gaira Pchusa Bashal Shonim, then she's also not considered Bichlal Kol. And if we should be matter to a mamzer, Be'echri Shetanakam Eina Sovek Reb Shimon, Elo, Shekol Gioris Asur B'Kuhuna. So again, it doesn't matter when a Geras took place. She's, according to Tanakama, rejecting Reb Shimon, she's always psul l'kuna. Bein shen is gaira b'yosef b'shol shonim, bein shen is gaira kodem l'chein. And l'chein omer Tanakama klal shekol asurim lovo b'kol kuna mutarim lovo psuli kol. If they're mutter in kal kahuna, then I'm sorry. Did I say mutter? I meant to say asr. If they're asr b'kal kahuna, it's because they're not called kal. If they're not called kal, then it should be mutar b'psula. So far everything works out. But the Gemara now rejects it. The Gemara says, Uklolu, can we really accept this klal of Rav Yehuda? To call asurim love b'kal kahuna mutarim love zeh. If they're mutter in kal kahuna, then it means that they're not considered kal. Then they should be mutter to marry a mamzer. Here I'll give you this whole list of cases of psule kahuna that are not possible to call. I'm sorry. Here I'm going to give you a list of psule kahuna that are also b'mamzer. So how can it be that Rabbi Yehuda had this klal? Again, when I talk about Rabbi Yehuda, I'm talking about the Amora, Rav Yehuda. I should be more precise about it. Visu, says the Gemara further, if you're telling me that they asid put psule kahuna from a mamzer, marriage to a mamzer, hamuter. If they weren't psule kahuna, but they were mutter, then it would be oslam. It says, right, gersh mutter b'kohanas mutter b'mazeres. We accept the shita of Yossi. Elom Rav Nosson Bar Oshia. Now we go on to possibility number 2. Now, according to Rav Nosson, the Tana is coming to add on top of Psulei Kol that are listed in the Mishnah, Psulei Kahuna. But here's where he differs from Rav Yehuda, the Amora. The Tanakama is not interested in Kol Asurim v'Kol Kahuna Mutarim l'Psulei Kol, that anyone who is also B'Kal Kahuna is therefore excluded from Kol and therefore is allowed to marry a mamzer, but rather Hachi Kama. This is what the Tanakhama has to say. Kol shekoin osur lisas bito. In other words, if a man cannot marry off his daughter to kahuna, my ninu, and what does that mean? Ger shenosig yor. So if both parents are gerim, he and she, then the bas is asura lekahuna. Again, we didn't get to this yet. Ukrabi Eliezer ben Yaakov in the Mishnah later on at Daf Ayin Zayin. And regarding these cases, the Tanakhama is holding mutarim lo b'zeh. They're allowed to marry psul kol. You know, it's at this point we're going to activate the principle of kahal gerim eno nikra kol. And why is that? Because both the father and the mother are gerim. So the Gemara rejects this interpretation of Tanakhama of Nosson as well. Uklolahu, is this really a klal? The kol shekoin also lisas pito mutarim b'psulei kol lovos ebezeh for a cholol shenosa bas Yisrael the kohen also lisa bito, right? So the daughter of a cholol, even though he was married legitimately to a Bas Yisrael, that daughter is a chalol. Basurim nami lovo zebazeh. And chalolim are not allowed to marry psulei kol. So how can you tell me that the Tanakhama made a klal muchlat? Here we have a situation where even though, right, the Bas is Asur LeKohen, nevertheless, there's no heter to have a relationship with a mamzer. So Gemara says that's not enough of an objection to Rav Nosson because Lo Kashik Rabbi Dostoi Ben Yehuda. Again, a sugya we didn't get up to on Daf Ayin Zayin, that Chol Shenosa Bas Yisrael Bito Ksheira Lakuna. So Memela, if Bito is Ksheira Lakuna, then the klal is correct. If the Kohen is also Lisa Bito, then we say Mutarim Zebezeh, and there's a heter to marry a mamzer. So Gemara further asks and objects to Rav Nosson. Varei Chol Shenosa Chalola, the Kohen also Lisa Bito, right? Obviously, both parents are Chalolim, and the child is a Chalol. Kohen's not allowed to marry a Chalol. The osanami lova bazeh, bazeh. So you set up a klal that according to that klal it should be a mutter to marry a mamzer because the kohen is also bebito. Here's a case where the kohen is also bebito, and yet the bas is not allowed to marry a mamzeres or a mamzer. And furthermore, it's difficult because from the Tanu says kol misha bito asur lekohen mutar b'psulei kol, it means with a diuk ha mutar. If there's a heter of lisa's bito, asur b'psulei kol. If that's the way you're going to learn, if I read Gersh and also Bas Yisrael, the kohen mutar lisa bito. And yet, umutarim zebazeh. Ella, so now we get to the third interpretation of the Tanakhama. El Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Bar Avua Hacha The Mishnah here, which records Machlokes Tanakam Rav Yehuda, is mamzer me'achoso, mamzer me'eshes ish. So keep in mind that if the Iser Arayas was a chiv misa, was a capital crime, then everybody agrees the child of an eshes ish is a mamzer. If, on the other hand, however, the violation was only an Iser kares, like, for example, achoso, then it's not 100% clear that the offspring from this marriage of a brother and a sister is a mamzer, because that's only chayv creases. So machlokes, according to Rav Nachman, between Tanakam and Rav Yehuda, is going to revolve around this question of a mamzer who is born from a relationship between a brother and a sister. Is Tanakam sover afilu mamzer me'achosa, even if it's only chayv creases. Nami Avi Mamzer generates Mamzerus. And Rabbi Yehuda Sarmeshis ish only if the Arayos is a capital crime with Mrs. Bezdin, like Eshes ish, then Havi Mamzer, but Me'achoso, it's only an Isur Kares, is Lo Avi Mamzer. So this sounds like an excellent shot in the Machlokas Shin Tanakama and Rav Yehuda. They're arguing about what, on the hierarchy, what is chomer enough of an ereva to generate mamzeres in the case of kares. The Gemara rejects this as well. Maika mashmalon, what is the Tan of our Mishnah coming to teach me? We already have this in a Mishnah in Yevamos, and this is Machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yeshua. And the Mishnah in Yevamos on Daf Mem Tes says Ezu Mamzer. Now we start with Rabbi Akiva. Kol shu below Yava. As long as it's only a lot. The Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva holds a chayve lab and generate mamzeres. And also, by the way, in Kiddushin Tovsa. Shimon HaTimni Omer, Kol Shechayav Olev Karis B'dei Shamayim, Vlad is a mamzer. This is what we're most familiar with, that if a brother would have a relationship with his sister, the child is a mamzer. Halach Kidvara. And Rabbi Yeshua is the Tana who requires a Chiyuv Mrs. Bezdin in order to generate mamzeres. Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Kol Shechayav Olev Mrs. Bezdin. So if a man has a relationship with an Ishish, the child is a mamzer. Man has a relationship with his sister, the child is not a mamzer. So the Gemara is asking now, why did Rebbe have to repeat this machlokas in the Mishnah here in Kiddushin? I mean, wouldn't it be enough that he just add that Rabbi Yehuda accepts the Shita Rabbi Yoshua? Elam Rava. Now we're up to the final round. 4 rounds of how to interpret the Tanakhama. Gera Moni Moavi Yikabeinayu. The machlokas between Tanakhama and Rabbi Yehuda revolves around Gerim, Ammonim, Umoav. And would such a ger be allowed to marry a mamzer? This is what Tanakhama means. Kol asurim lava b'kol, umay niu ger Ammonim Moav, mutarim lava zebazeh. In other words, there was never an issue. Everybody agrees that ger Ammonim Moavi is not considered Kal Hashem. I mean, they're not allowed to marry into the Jewish people. So those psulim of ger Ammonim Moavi means that ger Ammonim Moavi are not b'chal kol. And if they're not b'chal kol, they're allowed to marry mamzer. So the Gemara asks a kasha. We shouldn't get excited because the Gemara is going to answer this kasha. Ihachi, if the Mishnah is talking about ger amoni moavi and allowing such a ger to marry a mamzeres, is amai Rabbi Yehuda osir. Why should Rabbi Yehuda say that? I mean, it's quite clear that ger amoni moavi is not kal Hashem. They should be certainly mutter b'mamzeres. How can Rabbi Yehuda argue that? So the Gemara now is a kind of what's it called? Chisuri mechsere kind of thing. I don't know why the Gemara doesn't spell out chisuri mechsere, but I think that's the operative method here. Hachi kama. There's only one Tana in that Mishnah. We think that there's a machlokes in Tana Kama Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara denies it. Hachi kama. The Tana of the Mishnah says the following: Ger amoni avi are also b'kol, because they're not considered kol, and therefore they're mutar v'mamzeres. V'afal pish Rabbi Yehuda oser ger v'mamzeres. As a general rule, Rabbi Yehuda says that ger is not allowed to marry mamzeres. It means that kal ger nikra kol. So then we would have assumed, we would have anticipated that even in the case of ger amoni moavi, we should prohibit them from marrying a mamzeres, just like a ger. So a regular ger from any other nation other than Ammon or Moab is allowed to marry a mamzeres. I'm sorry, we're going to go to Rabbi Yehuda. Is forbidden from marrying, is prohibited from marrying a mamzeres. But here's a case of a ger, which even Rabbi Yehuda would concede is allowed to marry a mamzeres. Hani Mili, when does he say that a ger is not allowed to marry mamzeres? That's a ger de roy lava bakal. In other words, the gerus itself makes him roy lakal. Anybody could marry a ger of a Frenchman. The Torah says you're not allowed to let them ever, even generations down the line, enter into Kahal Yisrael. So then, they're not considered Kahal Hashem, and therefore they can marry a mamzeres. Torah Rabbanon, Pentesha Shonim Yom Echad, that means he's Roy Leviyah. But he's a ger ammonium avi mitzri vadomi kusi v'nosin chalol mamzer. What a mouthful of all the fat, all the psulim. Shebo ala kohenes. Any of the above had a relationship with a kohenes, a bas kohen. The al leviyah, the al bas Yisrael. Is psalua mi nase lekohen. I mean, lechora, this is pshita. I mean, any of the above would certainly passel the niveles from kahuna, from marrying a kohen. She becomes a chalol. And let's add another halacha. Let's say a father's a kohen, she can no longer eat truma. Rabbi Yossi Omer kol zaro posel posel. We don't know what that means. The Gemara is going to. B'chol she'ein zaro posel, eino posel. Rav Shimon Gamliel is even more ambiguous. Omer, here we turn to Daf Ayin Hey. Kol she'atanose espito atanose al menoso, b'chol she'atanose espito iatanose al menoso. Okay, we don't know what this means. So the Gemara asks, "My ika bein Tanakama bein Rav Yossi." What's the machlokas between Tanakama and Rav Yossi? Because Rav Yossi says that zaro posel is posel. So he certainly admits that all the psulim that are mentioned here in the long list enumerated by the Tanakama, since their zera is posel, therefore they are posling. On Rav Yochanan mitzvah sheni kabeinayu, we came up with an afkamina between the Tanakama and Rav Yossi. What's the story with Bias Mitzri? What kind of Mitzri? A Mitzri Sheni. The Torah only allows him after Shlishi, Adar Shlishi. So according to Tanakama, since he's not allowed to come into the kol, right? He's not allowed to marry a Jewish girl, is therefore he's a posa. If he has a relationship with a Bas Kohen Shera, he passes or makes her into a Zona. Aval Rabbi Yossi, he says that there's no psul. Why? Because the zera of the mitri is a mitri shlishi who's allowed to come to the call. And both the Tanakama Rabbi Yossi derive their din from the case of Kohen Gadol Balmana, and we're going to see two interpretations. What do we derive from the chilul of a Kohen Gadol Balmana? That he's machal to kahuna. Tanakama sover ki Kohen Gadol Balmana. Just like the case of Kohen Gadol with an almana, his bia apostles her. So too, bia sharpsu and poseles. Ma Kohen Gadol Balmana should be also ba'avera uposel, but she can no longer marry a Kohen. He said, "Af kol should be also ba'avera posel." So mitzvah sheni is a biyaso ba'avera, and therefore, like almana l'kohen gadol, it generates a psul of isha b'biyaso. Rabbi Yossi says, no, ki kohen gadol b'almana. Right, the bia of a kohen gadol to an almana apostles her, and so too bia of sharp psulim would apostle her. But my kohen gadol b'almana shezaro posul uposel is af kol shezaro posul is posel. So Rabbi Yossi zooms in on the fact that the zera is posel. And that's lafuki mitzri sheni she'ein zaro posel, because he's a mitzri shlishi, and he can marry a Kohen. Or if it's a she can marry a Kohen. The Omakra, Bonim Asher Yivoldu Lahem, Dor Shlishi Yavol Lahem Bakalasha. So since the Zera is kosher, his bia does not passel a woman for cooking. So what we're up to is Rav Shimon Gamliel. I think we'll leave that for tomorrow because it's a little bit more of an arichus tomorrow. I don't think we could chop it around. And we just finished up in 59 minutes. Okay, then. So that's what we're up to for tomorrow in Ritz Hashem of Shimon ben Gamliel.